My name is Steve Rode. I am the chief pilot for the airplane and the drone with the Wake Forest Fire Department. And as Tim mentioned, I'm also a drone pro here with the Greensboro FSDO. The goal today is to help answer all the questions for public safety operators, both law enforcement, fire, rescue, everybody. And if you have a question, go down to that questions tab that Tim mentioned and type your question in. We want to try to answer as many of your questions as possible during this presentation. The big goal here is to clear up misinformation that people have about public aircraft operations and operating drones in public safety. It's a very new field, and a lot of information is passed on and learned from one person to another, or something that we heard at a seminar or read in a magazine. But this is the crew. These people on this webinar from the FAA are the authorities that can help specifically answer your questions and, more importantly, keep us all out of trouble. And along the way, we encourage you to continue to use and utilize this new technology, but flying within the rules. So the panel that we have today is John Meehan. He's from the National Outreach Program with the FAA, a gentleman, a scholar, and a very nice person that you should reach out to or talk to. Also, we have Kate Barber. She's an attorney with the FAA, an enforcement attorney, along with Heather Spangler, who's also another FAA attorney, an enforcement attorney with the FAA, who deals with enforcement issues on a regular basis. You have myself, North Carolina Drone Pro, and as I mentioned, with the Wake Forest Fire Department. And we have Tim Camlin, who is the drone point of contact with the Greensboro FSDO. And we also have Tim Haley, who kind of runs the show there, and he is the man in charge. Our goal as a team here is to help you understand that there are lots of good people at the FAA that want to help you find the right answers and utilize drones in public safety. Like I said, there's so much rampant misinformation out there that you have to be proactive and hunt down the answers yourself. I personally have a website, PS, like public safety flight, psflight.org, where I publish regular articles and also answer questions from people in the public safety field. And it is always interesting when you get a question and then you research it, how the facts really don't support many of the assumptions that people have. So today, we hope to leave you with good information so you can make good decisions. To even make it more complex in the public safety world, there are two sets of rules that people can fly under. We have the Certificate of Waiver or Authorization, also known as the COA, or we have Part 107 operations. And I find that a lot of public safety organizations are confused by what the rules are. And to make it even more confusing, the rules for a COA flight and a Part 107 flight are not the same, and it can be very complex. I was going to say the damage, but the consequences of not flying within the rules or making assumptions is there can be an investigation of the actions of both the pilot, the responsible person with the department, the department itself. And it's important to know that not every investigation begins with a crash or an incident or something like that. In public safety, we've all faced the, what's the political correct term? We've all faced the agitated citizen sometimes who misunderstands exactly what we're doing. And all it takes is somebody who is agitated or upset for whatever reason to contact any of the FAA FSDO offices, and that starts a complaint. And I'd like Tim Haley to talk for a moment about what happens when an investigation starts.
Well, Steve, you know, the investigation, probably a large percent of the people on here are law enforcement, so they know how the investigation process works. But, you know, it all starts with a somebody calling in a complaint or somebody observing a complaint and reporting it to the FSDO. And by law, we're required to investigate every complaint we get, no matter if it seems like it's just some kind of trivial complaint or not. Half the time the people calling in are not aware of what the rules and regulations are. So yeah, some of the complaints we get, there's no legitimacy to them at all. So the first thing that's going to happen is when it gets assigned to a aviation safety inspector, he's going to make a call to the drone operator. He could ask for some documentation. And on this initial call, he's just trying to find out if he needs to continue with this investigation or it's just totally bogus because the drone operator is operating within inside the law. So, he might ask for a flight log. He's clearly going to ask to see a pilot certificate, probably going to see if you've had some kind of biannual flight review or 24-month flight review. He might ask if you've got some training records. Probably going to ask you to download the flight data from the flight profile so you've got some of that information. Probably also going to want to see that the drone is registered. He's just looking to see if there's any kind of issues there that he needs to investigate further. And then if from that initial contact, which I want to encourage you to be as cooperative with this guy as you can, because he's got some paperwork on his desk and he's really wanting just to get that moved along. So if he can determine right quick that you didn't break any laws, he can close this case out and move on. Otherwise, after that, you're going to receive what we call a letter of investigation. And that's where we're taking it to the next step. And from there, he's going to ask for support and documentation to prove to him that you were operating within the rules and regulations. And from there, it's the standard case that even the law enforcement guys on here know about. From there, all the items of proof get put together, and that's when it gets forwarded on to our attorneys, and that's when they start the legal action of the case. And some guys are operating out there without a certificate, and they're thinking, I don't have an airman certificate. There's nothing that can happen to me. Those guys soon find out that with the lack of an airman certificate, then we're looking at civil penalties. So, if you've got a certificate, an airman certificate, then you're probably looking at certificate suspension. If you don't have one, then you're looking at civil penalties. And that's pretty much how we handle it right there. And it's handled at the local FSDO level.
All right. Thank you, Tim. And one of the things that Tim mentioned was part of the information that the pilot is going to be asked for is not only their pilot certificate, but also flight logs and data. And this is why it always pays to know the regulations, fly within the law, is because that telemetry, that flight log, when an investigator looks at it, can really throw you under the bus and show that you were not flying compliantly. So there is a record that will show whether or not you're flying within the regulations. And if you're not flying within the regulations, there are two big things that might catch you. One of them is unique for COA agencies, and we're going to talk about that coming up. But it's important to remember that no matter who you are, the pilot in command is always responsible for the operation of the aircraft. Everything that's going to fall on the department or the responsible person, the COA or anything else, is ultimately also going to land on the shoulders of the person operating the drone, operating the controls. That's the remote pilot in command. If the aircraft is found to have been operated in a manner that violates the federal aviation regulations, the pilot can face a number of consequences, and the monetary penalties can really add up. They can be severe. So I would like to introduce John Meehan for our next slide to talk about the differences between a COA and a Part 107, and especially this very tricky subject of if a flight qualifies as a public aircraft operation. John?
Oh, nice, easy one. Thanks. Yeah, so we get this question all the time, but before I get to that, we've got a lot of public safety folks on here, and I really want everyone to understand that anyone who flies an aircraft, and a drone is an aircraft, anyone who flies an aircraft in the National Airspace System, other than the United States military, is governed by Title 14 of the U.S. Code. And that means you. So if you're on this webinar, it applies to you. And public safety, if you are a qualified government entity, which is essentially the federal government or a state or U.S. territory or the District of Columbia or Indian Tribal Nation or a political subdivision of those, you may qualify to operate as a public aircraft. And these are defined not by you, not by me, but this is actually defined by the United States Congress in the United States Code as to what is a public aircraft. And it's not what you think it is. So take a look at that. For example, if you're a 501(c) entity, more than likely you are not eligible for what we call public aircraft operations by law. So there's some entities are able to qualify for this, but then there's also an additional limitation on what kind of missions can be flown as a public aircraft, and they're very limited. There's only 6 or 7 types of missions: law enforcement, firefighting, search and rescue, biological and geological resource management, aeronautical research. I forget, there might be another one there, but that's in the statute. That's listed in the statute as well. And you're either if you fly as a public aircraft, and remember I told everyone everybody on this webinar is going to be governed by Title 14. Title 14 has different parts. One of the parts is called Part 107, and another one of those parts is called Part 91. And if you fly as a public aircraft, you're actually flying under 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 91. And if you're flying under Part 107, you're operating as a civil aircraft under Part 107. So I think you asked me, Steve, what's the difference? In my opinion, the main difference is that you can do 100% of your missions that you're asked to do as public safety. You can do 100% of those missions as a Part 107 civil operator. You can do only a very limited, very small amount of those missions as a public aircraft. And any flight that the FAA deems was not a qualified public aircraft flight is deemed as a civil flight under Part 107. Does that answer your question, Steve, or did you want me to go further?
Yes, and an important point that our audience should know is that for helicopter operations, like law enforcement, even fire helicopter operations, that could operate under a COA as a public aircraft operation. Yep. John, you have mentioned many times
many of them
that they choose not to.
Yeah, that's right. And there's about 350, I think there's about 350 helicopter units out in the country. And every time I have the chance, when I'm talking with their chief pilot, I always ask them, hey, you guys are qualified as public aircraft. Do you operate as public aircraft or do you operate as the civil aircraft? And I've never had one yet tell me that, well, they all say, no, we only do Part 91 as a civil aircraft. And I asked them why. And they said, well, we do it for a number of reasons. One reason is that it's too complicated to know 2 sets of rules for our pilots. But the second one is that in order to have the ability to do all the missions we're required to do, we have to have a Part 61 helicopter pilot certificate, which is required when you fly as a civil aircraft. For example, if we want to fly the governor around, you can't do that as a public aircraft. They have to do it as a civil aircraft. And so the civil rules apply. So they have to have a FAA commercial helicopter pilot certificate to do that. And another reason they tell me they do this is they require any pilot applicants to walk in the door with a FAA pilot certificate. And they say the reason they do that is because they want everybody to start with a basic level of knowledge about the National Airspace System, how to read a visual flight rules sectional, for example. They don't want to have to teach that, which they would have to do as a public aircraft operator, that thing.
And John, there are some other quicksand areas in the whole COA operation. Look, I understand why lots of people went the COA route and why they feel that it is best for them. But I've actually found exactly what I mentioned before, is that they haven't asked all the right questions and they don't understand the whole COA thing. Like, for example, if you are operating under a COA and you want to train new pilots to fly for your department that do not have a Part 107 certificate, John, training flights are not approved public aircraft operations, are they?
Yeah, that's right. Public aircraft, the statutes are Office of General Counsel has determined that the statutes do not allow for training flights as a public aircraft. So training flights, and this is even mission-specific training flights. So you're going to have your Part 107 certificate anyway, or fly under the immediate guidance, or you have to be flying next to a Part 107 certificated pilot who's in a position to take control. But yeah, so it's a big landmine out there.
So John, Charles Bunn has asked a question, a very good question. He says, if all of your agency pilots are 107, is there still a need for a COA?
That's a decision that's really best made by the agency itself. But in John's personal opinion, I am not convinced that you need the COA. And you started to allude to it earlier, but UAS and the rules and policies are evolving every day. And about, I would say 2-3 years ago, COAs were pretty compelling. And I liken this to be like a pendulum swinging back and forth. And in the early days, COAs had a big advantage, which was you could fly at night and you could, in a life safety situation, you could operate over a person. Well, those are gone now. Those advantages are gone now because in April of this year, Part 107 was amended to allow for night flight without a waiver. You have to undergo the current training, which includes night specific topics, and you have to equip your drone with lighting, just like you had to do with a COA. So that advantage is gone. So there, and then the other advantage used to be, well, now you can operate. That advantage went away when we amended 10739, which is operations over people. Now you can operate over people without a waiver, but you must have what we call a category approved drone, and that's in process. There is a drone category, they call it category 1, that those are very small drones, but you could operate today over people with a category 1 drone under Part 107. So,
and just to be clear, John, if you're flying under a COA now, can you fly over people? Are there operations that are allowed?
Well, you can only fly over people for very, very brief periods under COA in a life safety situation. In other words, if you don't, somebody's going to die. That's pretty much the standard that's written into the COA.
And John, that's a great part. Sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah.
but when we talk about emergency situations to fly, you clarified it there. It has to be life safety.
It has to be
right?
life safety. That's right. Yeah. And this is because, why do we have the flight rules? They're darned inconvenient for public safety, aren't they? Yeah, they are. Sometimes they are, but they're there for everyone's safety. And remember, it's a shared airspace. We want our aviators to operate their aircraft in a safe way that's not going to injure persons and property on the ground as well. And a drone falling out of the sky, hitting someone with kinetic energy it's going to leave a mark. And so that's why those rules are there. They're not there because we like, making things inconvenient for people. They're there because of safety.
And let me beat this dead horse yet again about drone safety, is that no drone flying today has ever passed any certification test or proven to be safe. They are not built to any standard more than any piece of consumer electronics, and they fall out of the sky every day, or they fly away, or they have some other malfunction. They are not as reliable as a type certificated aircraft, and those drones are coming. There are companies in the process right now that are working to pass safety certification tests, And those drones will be in the category 4 for operations over people and have much more latitude than any other drone out there.
Yeah, it's going to be a big paradigm shift. I believe that when type certificated drones hit the market, I would think a lot of government entities are going to want to take a hard look at those.
John, Aaron Boswell asks, isn't a COA beneficial for flying in airspace other than G?
I would argue that now that we have Lance and now that Lance is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, I would argue that not anymore is my answer. COAs, when you apply for a COA, you're going to be asked, do you want a blanket COA or a jurisdictional COA? And remember, when you fly under a COA, you're flying under Part 91. And Part 91 was written for manned aircraft, and there's a lot of and essentially what you're getting are some waivers and exemptions, but you're still going to need an airspace authorization to go fly. And most of you are going to get what we call a blanket COA that's applicable only in Class G airspace, and it'll allow you to go do your work in Class G. If you want to fly in controlled airspace, unfortunately, under Part 91, Lance is not available to Part 91 operators. So I would argue that, in fact, you would want to have Part 107 now because you're going to get a Lance authorization much faster than you would. You're going to have to apply for another COA called a jurisdictional COA, and that's going to have to be coordinated with every air traffic facility in the area that you're asking for approval for, and there's going to be additional steps to do that. And this is probably just as good of a time as ever, but those of you who have a COA, pull it out, read it, because I think you're going to find inside those COAs, there's a significant limitation that prohibits drone operations within 5 nautical miles of a towered airport, 2 nautical miles of any airport, and 2 nautical miles of any heliport. So,
and the problem, John, is that there are heliports scattered everywhere. Everywhere. And so, but if you have a Part 107 certificate, you can fly within 5 miles of an airport by just getting a Lance airspace authorization. So, and also, John, when it comes to airspace authorizations, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that through the FAA Drone Zone, a Part 107 pilot can apply for flight in controlled airspace. There are waivers that are available, and we've never talked about this, but the process for obtaining that waiver is similar to a COA, right? You apply for the waiver, the FAA contacts the control agency. Tower.
Yeah, you're getting really what we call it's just a longer term operational airspace authorization.
Yeah.
Waivers have different meaning. That the term waiver, the term exemption, those are very significant words in the FAA speak. And but you can get by going to Drone Zone, and I'll ask one of my colleagues to put the link up to FAAdronezone.faa.gov. I forget, but if y'all could put that up there. But you would get an airspace authorization for multiple days, for example, by submitting that in Drone Zone, and then that would go to the service center in the region that covers the airport in question, and they'll coordinate with the tower directly and get that for you. And you should identify yourself as public safety and the reason you need it. And don't bother saying I need 365 days every year, every day, every year, just because. That's not going to be sufficient.
And Andy says, and he's made a statement that if you need authorization in a Lance zero altitude location, the FAA has turned around our non-emergency requests in 2 days, much, much faster than the old way. So Drone Zone.
I mean, they are getting better and better about it. And listen, one of the important takeaways I think we want this audience to have is that, look, if you have a real emergency and you can't fully comply with Part 107, if you're operating under Part 107, or if you can't fully comply with 91 or your COA, and it's a real emergency, make the phone call to the Systems Operations Support Center. It's 24/7, and explain the situation, and they will do the coordination and get you airborne. And I'm told that many of my contacts tell me that it's minutes now instead of days or hours like it used to be, 3-4 years ago. And again, it's evolving every day, and it gets better and better every day.
And that's true.
I think, and just one more thing I wanted to add. So one of the other advantages of Part 107 is you can get an airspace authorization now 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without having to call anybody. Whereas if you're flying under a COA and you have your blanket COA and you need to get into the controlled airspace, well, you got to make that phone call now. That's one extra step. Whereas with 107 and Lance, you just do it on your phone and you're good to go.
So let me mention that again, that page on my website, psflight.org/REF, has all the links that we're talking about here. The top link in bold is the one to the FAA Emergency Operation Request. John, I have found that the folks in Washington who are available 24 hours a day to call are extremely professional, helpful, want to make the Part 107 emergency flight happen, whatever the situation is. There are a lot of things that pilots and agencies can do ahead of time. If you go to that page that's linked there, you will see the request form. And what I do is I have printed out that request form. I've filled in all the information on it that I'm going to need that isn't variable. And so I have that readily at hand if I need to submit it to the DC office.
And put a copy with dispatch.
Absolutely.
If you have, maybe you got a phone issue, have dispatch make the call for you, right? So there's lots of ways, but yeah, that's a good idea. Have it pre-filled out as much as possible because they want to know what's your phone number in case they got to call you. Maybe they've got an inbound airliner that's got an emergency. Maybe they're going to tell you get out of the way, right? So you can have a lot of that stuff already pre-filled out.
Luis Martinez made a comment that I don't disagree with as a man pilot. He says he's talking about COA agencies having to issue NOTAMs for flight operations. And he says it's getting ridiculous because all these NOTAMs are being issued that serve no real useful purpose. And it's just saying, we may or may not fly. And I have found that the issuance of NOTAMs is another one of those just painful COA administrative things that can set you up to failure. It's one thing to also have to submit records of your flights and everything else, but as a COA agency and maintaining your public aircraft, oh my gosh, the record keeping for maintaining a public aircraft operation is extensive. And if you're not doing it now and you're not complaining about all the record keeping you're having to do for your drone, you're not doing it right. On that link page, Dan Kelly, who has been posting links here, he's probably going to post links to AC 9191 maintaining public aircraft. If you have a drone and you want to comply with the regulations, that document will blow your mind.
I think another factor that folks need to consider is the reporting requirements. I don't know. We just touched on that, but the NOTAM's just one of them. But you have to report every malfunction that happens with your drone when you fly under a COA. And under Part 107, you only have to report those crashes that meet the threshold stated, basically $500 or more worth of damage or serious injury to a person. Whereas in a COA, there's a big list of things that are reportable to the FAA. And while I've got the microphone, I know I'm talking a lot here, but there's also separate NTSB reporting requirements. If you have a true flyaway, for example, either 107 or 91, you have to make that report. But yeah, if you like keeping lots of records and you like writing reports and you like filing NOTAMs, then maybe the COA is good for you. If you don't like doing that, then maybe the Part 107 is good for you.
Here's another gotcha, John, is if you are operating in a state where the government agencies have very open record laws or Freedom of Information Act requests, all of that information on flights, personnel, all that can be can be requested by anybody, and certainly it would be discoverable in the case of any sort of civil lawsuit. So more records to hang you with. John, we're talking about COAs still, and so Christian Dick asks a question. Isn't a COA required to obtain a tactical beyond visual line of sight waiver?
Yes, it is. You have to be a COA holder to get that. They're issuing those under Part 91. And I looked at one of those the other night, and I saw that in the same document where they said you could go tactical beyond visual line of sight, the document also said that, oh, by the way, you can't fly within 5 nautical miles of a towered airport, and you can't fly within 2 miles of a heliport. So I would argue that while tactical beyond visual line of sight is certainly an option, you could get the same temporary emergency approval by calling the SOSC.
Absolutely.
Explaining the situation, and they can give it to you right there. And so
absolutely. And another thing, John, this is kind of a one of these evolving topics right now, but under a COA, it requires you to have a visual observer to fly at night, under MOST, correct?
Right. Yep. That's typically a standard clause for Part 91 COAs, but not required under 107.29.
So discussions that I've been having recently is whether or not a tactical beyond visual line of sight waiver would eliminate the need to have a visual observer at night.
I think they're apples and oranges. You are required in your COA to have a visual observer at night, period, full stop.
So there goes the problem with the COA at night, period, full stop, with the visual observer is a tactical beyond visual line of sight waiver is for the pilot. The pilot might not have line of sight, but under a COA, if you are flying at night, you have to have a visual observer that is able to maintain sight of that aircraft. It can significantly limit your operations and expose you to more questions in case of a problem. Who wants to tackle airworthiness with drones and COAs? I know, John, I've been picking on you a lot, but...
Well, I'll start it, and then if anybody else wants to jump in. So, if you look at what does airworthiness mean, and I think one of our attorneys the other day had a great description, and feel free to jump in if I misstate this, but essentially airworthiness means that it conforms to the type certificate and it's in a safe condition for flight. Now, drones that people are using today do not yet, and I emphasize the word yet, they don't have an airworthiness certificate. And what we do under Part 107 is we recognize this, and under the Part 91 COAs is that's a determination that is really left to the remote pilot and command. And in the case of a COA, it's also under the responsible person's responsibility, and it's also the agency's responsibility because they have given the FAA a statement that we deem this to be airworthy. And the airworthy regulations are in Part 21, 23, and I believe 43 is, but Tim or one of those other folks can correct me if I'm wrong there. But so, and remember that you as the pilot in command are ultimately responsible for everything that happens or fails to happen with that flight. If you're flying under Part 107, there's one of the 107 regulations says that the pilot in command is the final authority. So no matter what the chief says, if you can't do it and conform with the regulations, you're on the hook. Part 91, it's 91.3 also. So you're still responsible as the remote pilot in command for that. But airworthy, it's an endless debate. Essentially what we want is these aircraft to be in a safe condition for flight, which means you've done a pre-flight, right? You've looked at it. You've done the manufacturer's maintenance. If a blade's been broken, in fact, if you're under a COA and you broke a blade, you're supposed to report that to the FAA. It's in your COA, and you gotta have maintenance logs and maintenance records. And
well, speaking of propellers, John, under public aircraft maintenance AC 9191, you also need to keep track of the time in operation for each of those parts too. I mean, it's an endless administration.
It's 9191. It's an advisory circular, so it's recommended practice. But ultimately, right? Why is this important? Well, if something bad happens and the FAA shows up on your doorstep, you're going to have to justify your actions, right? And how are you going to do that? You're going to be asked to show documentation. That's all.
Well, the propeller issue has been a problem in drone accidents, both in the United States and the UK, where the UK has issued guidance that propellers should not be used more than 5 hours. And the only way you know how long you've used it is by tracking it. So maybe some of that's coming. Jennifer asks a question, John, if a department decides they no longer want their COA, what is the process for terminating it?
I believe that in the COA is an email address, but you can go to CAPS and you can cancel your COA in CAPS, I believe. And you can also send an email, say you want your COA canceled.
All right. Matthew asks.
You could also let it expire. Remember, they don't have an unlimited life.
Yeah. Matthew asks, he works for a police department in a town that does not have LANCs. I love this question. And it's in controlled airspace. What will it take to get LANCs in my community? We've been trying 2 years to get LANCs at my local airport. John, this sounds like something that we've talked about just a few minutes ago about going to FAA Drone Zone and applying for an extended that
one sounds like what we would call a wide area authorization request. And it depends on who controls that airspace. If it's U.S. military, a DOD controlled airspace, they have to agree. And not all airports that is a joint airport where they control it. So not all of those facilities are on there. If you have an emergency, don't let that stop you, right? Go make the phone call to the SOSC. Mm-hmm. Tell them you've got an emergency and it's inside the zero grid of such and such an airport. There's no excuse not to make that call, right? There's no excuse, and it takes seconds. And I would bet that if they got enough of those phone calls, things might change. But we want the audience to understand that we're incorporating more and more airports every day into the LANC system. There's a process they have to go through. The federal contract towers are being added as well. So there's different layers, and DOD has a bunch of airports that they control. I think the Navy seems to be more amenable than the Army. We don't control that, right? So they're working through that. And again, right, this is every day is a new day, and every day is an evolution. Every day it does get better. I think everybody would say it's a lot better than it was 2-3 years ago. There's no magic switch, but remember, if you're in that situation, I would go to Drone Zone and make the request. Tell them early on that you're public safety and put some why you need to be able to get in there. And then until you get that approval, that long-term approval, don't let the fact that it's an emergency inside controlled airspace stop you from doing your mission. Make the phone call to the SOSC, and the FAA will get you. They'll work those phones. They'll get with the controlling airport or air traffic facility, and they'll get you in. We want public safety to be able to do their mission, right? They're not now. If it's not an emergency, then they're going to say no.
Well, let me give our viewers 2 pro tips. One is become very familiar with the FAA emergency operation request and the folks in DC. I encourage everyone to look up the information through the links that we've given you, and maybe Dan again can post that link in the chat section, and give the folks in DC a proactive call and just ask them every question that you have before it's an actual emergency, so that you learn what they're expecting from you and what they can do. And it never hurts to make
and ask your drone pro. Before you do that, ask your drone pro.
Yep, I'll raise my hand. I can absolutely help with that. The second pro tip that I have is, I think it's a mistake when you're operating in any area that has controlled airspace that you haven't reached out proactively to the control tower and explained, not demanded that I demand to fly in your airspace, but I find that many approvals are about relationships, going there and talking to them about what you're doing. And like, for example, here in the Raleigh, North Carolina area, there I can fly in almost all of the airspace at the airport, but I am aware of what the approach and departure corridors are. And that's just off limits because the aircraft are so low in those two corridors, narrow corridors, that there's no way I would either ask them to fly there or get permission to fly there. So
let me just say something though, that I think that's a great idea off hours, but one of the things the FAA does not want public safety doing is they do not want you calling the tower trying to get an airspace authorization.
That is correct.
So kind of two separate things, right? If you can get your LANC authorization, go do it. If you can't do that, it's an emergency, make the phone call to the SOSC. The SOSC will have the conversation. But I think that is a good idea to, when it's not busy for the tower folks, go get a tour of the facility, have the conversation.
Yeah, don't call the tower. Don't call the tower for a waiver.
Yeah,
you should make friends with your tower so that when your waiver request comes through the channels, they go, oh, that's Bob. Yeah, he's a good guy. Done. Okay, Davis Powers says, when I passed my Part 107 test, I agreed to stick with the rules. If I have to follow a suspect, but he goes to an area where I might go beyond visual line of sight or over 400 feet, what do I do?
Call the SOSC. And if you can't do it, have your dispatch do it.
And if none of those work, you have to land. I mean, you
got to listen. You got to comply with the rules. Or not. There could be a ultralight flying through, no radio, right? It could be a helicopter, HEMS. How do you know? You don't know. These drones are. We would all love to be able to let everybody go autonomous beyond visual line of sight, but the reality is that the current state of technology with drones is not there yet. It's not, right? And
so Davis
they
says,
become unguided missiles.
Davis says that, what do I do? He took an oath to preserve life. I get it. But
what
like
life
John
in the
just
air?
said,
What life in the air?
These are built to no standard. I said they are built to no standard greater than a toy. They operate on unregulated radio spectrum. They are not safe to fly outside of the rules. They will be. They are not right now.
Make the
we
phone
are
call.
quickly getting towards the end of the webinar, and we haven't yet heard from our great attorneys. So Heather and Kate, can you give us some words of wisdom about if pilots should fly within the rules, what you look for when an enforcement action comes to your desk, and what advice you have for our public safety pilots?
Yeah, I can start, Steve. I think to make it as short as I can, because I'm sure I could talk forever about advice I might give to public safety, but I think one of the most important things is if you are operating under Part 107, you need to read Part 107. So you need to know what it says, what the rules are, and it's really probably one of the easier regulations we have for the FAA to read through and understand. And if you're operating under a COA, you need to read your COA. Ultimately, it's the remote pilot and command's responsibility, whether it's Part 107 or you're operating under a COA, to follow the rules. So it's really difficult, I would think, for you to follow the rules if you've never actually read what the COA says. And you're required under the COA to have read it, understand it, and to have it with you. So I think for me, that's really important. And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but just to remind, everybody that it's really ultimately you as the pilot, whether Part 107 or a COA, that's going to face the consequences if you violate the regulations. And Tim talked about it a little bit earlier, but you could be facing, suspension or revocation of your remote pilot certificate, or if you don't have one, you could be facing a civil penalty that's assessed per violation. So it could get up to $5,000 or $6,000 that you're facing if you don't follow the rules. So if I could stress anything, it's read through this guidance we've provided you, read your COA, read Part 107, and really try to understand what the rules are.
So Heather, you mentioned read the COA, and that's an important point, that all pilots under the COA are required to have a copy of it with them at all times. So they should have it readily at hand to read. Kate, do you have any words of wisdom from the enforcement side?
Well, I would, echo everything that Heather just stated, and, just to understand that, use your best judgment, know the rules, and follow them because they are in the best interest of safety. And above all, if you have any questions, reach out to people that have the answers, whether it be myself or Heather or anybody on this webinar. Everybody is pretty passionate and willing to help you get to the solution or answer any questions that you have. And and if you have an emergency, call the SOC. That the FAA is always willing to work with you, and we're just here to help you and to educate you and make sure that everything is done, to the best and the safest possible link. And we want to make sure that these resources with the drones are used in the safest way for public service and that they can help you. And we want to make sure that you are educated and feel confident in your abilities. And again, if you have any questions, just reach out to us. Pretty sure that covers just about everything, or at least John covered it all. So,
well, Kate, I think you would agree with this, that the worst thing that you can do is assume that you understand what all the regulations are. The slide that we have up in front of us is a good example of that. When we talk about flying both with a COA or Part 107, here is an assumption that a lot of pilots just don't understand. If you are flying during the day to maintain the visual line of sight, there are a number of factors that you have to be able to see and determine visually by looking at it, not with the telemetry from your controller. And you can look under CFR 107.31 to see what those are. So Robert Zaracina in Minnesota went out with his co-pilot and tested to see exactly what the distances were in order to comply with visual line of sight. And what he found was rather surprising, that in order to maintain the drone within the regulations during the day, if you did not look down and you did not look away, you could fly as far as about 1,200 feet from the pilot to be able to maintain those criteria. If you looked away, it was almost impossible to spot the drone again or find it, even with a visual observer. And you had to fly the drone back towards the pilot, even as close as only 600 feet from the pilot. And this chart that we have in front of us shows the altitude that you were flying at and the distance from you that you would have to be able to maintain the visual line of sight requirements. This orange area in the center, this flight recapture, is if it was distance from you and you look down and you look back, you'd have to fly the drone back. You can probably capture it between 500 and 900 feet away from you. Just being able to see the dot in the sky is not going to cover you. And as we've said, if there's an accident or an injury or an incident or a complaint even, and your flight logs telemetry are requested either voluntarily or, as Heather has mentioned, with a subpoena, your flight telemetry might show that you were outside of these ranges. And to make it even more alarming, if we look at the next slide, at night flight and visual line of sight flight is actually going to be a webinar that we're planning for next month to talk about this in depth. But one of the assumptions I hear all the time from people is, I have strobe lights on my drone. I can see them for 3 miles. I can fly far away at night. The reality is, no, the strobe lights on the drones are not for you. They are for separation from manned aircraft. They are actually not part of the requirement that you have to maintain visual line of sight. So when your drone gets even a little bit far away from you at night in the dark, you cannot maintain visual line of sight. That would be non-compliant flight in the testing, real world testing, using a Mavic and a Phantom and a Matrice. The drone could be no further than about 100 feet from the pilot at night in order to maintain compliant visual line of sight. This is where a bunch of you right now are going to say, that can't be true. We've been flying like that for years. We've been flying at night at distances and stuff. Well, this is an opportunity. We're just trying to help give you information, because as Ken Welch asked here in the question and answer box, he goes, is there any good news? Well, Ken, if you were looking for good news, you should probably go to a manufacturer's marketing seminar. What we're trying to give everyone is the facts so that they can fly safe and not have to face any civil penalties. Or actually, there have been pilots the last Super Bowl that facing criminal penalties for some of their operations, just because your public safety doesn't give you a waiver for doing things that are dangerous.
Steve, this is John here. Can I jump in a little
yes.
bit? So I think there is good news. The good news is that the regulations are evolving to enable your operations as we get more data and we get more real information. So and you can see that in the modifications that were done to Part 107 to allow for operations over people and for night. So that's positive. I think the other good news is we've got the SOSC is available to you 24/7. I mean, that's huge. And then, on this whole 3 statute miles, night flight and visual line of sight, and I think Heather and Kate both reemphasize this, you got to go back and read the regulations, and you'll see that each one of those, you got 107.1, 107.2, 107.3, all the way down. Each one of those covers a different thing. And the visual line of sight regulation that says visual line of sight, it defines what the FAA means by that. It doesn't mean what you and I may think initially, like, oh yeah, I see that speck of something out there. That's not what the FAA's definition of visual line of sight is. And if you have a situation where we're coming to investigate, guess what's definition we're going to apply? It's the one that's in the regulation, right? And that visual line of sight criteria applies. If you read it very carefully, you'll see that this applies in day, night, good weather, bad weather. It doesn't say like, and at night you can, no, it says you got to see it well enough with vision unaided, except for eyeglasses, essentially, at all times during the flight, well enough to know its location, altitude, attitude, direction of flight, the surrounding airspace. You're not a hazard to people and property on the ground and in the air. And if I've gone back and looked at the proposed rulemaking when all of this started happening, and one of the issues that the FAA was very concerned about is operating at night over people when you can't see those people. And that means they've got to be pretty close to you. So I know I piled on there, but I think there is good news. I think we really want you all to understand that Part 107.29, I call it really more of the prerequisites to fly at night. They're not the approvals to fly at night. It's the prerequisites. There is one blurb in there about if during the flight you can dim it for safety reasons, but they're pretty much a prerequisite there, right? The 107.31 is visual line of sight. That's the criteria for what. So seeing the speck of light 3 miles out is not going to work.
And John, I think the best news that we have from this webinar is that what we're giving everybody is straight, hard reality facts that they can use to operate confidently in all these situations to avoid any complications from flight. So we want you. We all want you. All the FAA folks that are on this webinar, all the brain power that went into putting this together for them to share their information with you is here because we all want to help you. And Tim, I know that we've posted these links in the chat box as we've gone along. If we can advance to slide 18, put that on the screen. I have a question and answer that from the webinar here. Chris says, what happens when we're in controlled airspace and we have crime or crash scenes that we have to investigate? And then Jeff says, well, he answers the question himself. He says, well, we get waivers regularly in zero airspace for crime and crash. So it is possible. Become familiar with the folks in DC. Learn what that procedure is. For our law enforcement folks, this is who you can contact for more information. leap@faa.gov, or contact the UAS help desk, uashelp@faa.gov, or call, I don't know what the number is, 844-FLY-MY-UA, so whatever that turns out to be. And as we said, everybody here always wants people to fly safe, to excel. And I personally recognize that many drone pilots out there are new aviators. And so I encourage you all to find an aviation mentor that has studied aviation and familiar with it. It might be a manned pilot. It might be an air traffic controller. I have many friends who are controllers who teach me something new every day. I've been a manned pilot since 1988. I'm always learning, and I encourage you to find a mentor. My contact information will be here in just a moment. You can always, oh, there it is. You can always reach out to me directly in North Carolina. Don't hesitate to reach out to Tim Camlin. There's his contact information. He's at the Greensboro FSDO, and he's a drone point of contact. Tim Haley and Dan Kelly are exceptional members of the Greensboro FSDO who are responsible not just for drones, but for all sorts of education, and they are great contacts to ask for more information. Gentlemen and ladies and pilots, we are out of time, but you never assume, never trust anything you heard in the grapevine without double checking it yourself. And as I said, a good pilot is always learning. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. That was pretty informative. There was a lot of information there. We also have a lot of links that were put into the chat. Also, we'll probably download all the Q&A session, and some of the questions that we did not get to, we'll try to get back to them in the next week. So I appreciate everybody turning out. It looks like we had about 165 there at one time. So thank you for your interest. I've seen as far away as Texas attending today. So appreciate everybody attending today, and we'll wrap this up.